you, everybody, for attending today's talk. Today's talk is Real and Imagined Colonial Race Relations by Ciara Smart. Ciara is a PhD candidate at the University of Tasmania. Her research focuses on the nuances of Australasian-Irish history, with a particular focus on colonial race relations. These talks are organised by the Professional Historians of Australia, Victoria, Tasmania branch and hosted by Libraries Tasmania. Today, we're also offering these talks as a webinar, and we're pleased to welcome those people who are joining us online today. We'll still be continuing to record the talks and to make them available on Libraries Tasmania SoundCloud, and you can access the talks. You can access Libraries Tasmania SoundCloud by clicking on the cloud icon at the bottom of our homepage. And if you missed any of the other professional historians' talks, you can also listen to them on SoundCloud. And this talk may also be available on YouTube with Ciara's permission. Now, if you haven't already done so, please switch off your phones. And before I hand you over to Ciara, I'd like to read to you Library Tasmania's acknowledgement of Tasmania's Aboriginal peoples. Libraries Tasmania recognises the deep histories and cultures of the Aboriginal people of Lutruwita, Tasmania. We acknowledge Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional and continuing custodians of the land, waters and sky. We pay respects to the elders past and present who hold the memories, traditions, culture and knowledge of country. We extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples whose countries were never ceded. Ciara will take questions at the end of the talk. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Ciara.
Just stop me if there's any problems with the sound. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and nice to see all these people here in person today, and hello to everyone that's listening in online. So my name is Ciara Smart, and today I'm presenting from Lutruwita, Tasmania. And before I start, I'd like to pay my respects to the original inhabitants of the Hobart area, the Muwinina people, and I recognise, of course, that Indigenous land in Australia and also New Zealand was not ceded. Thank you very much to the Professional Historians Network of Tasmania and Victoria, and of course the Tasmanian State Library for the opportunity to speak here today. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Tasmania. My research specifically looks at Irish relations with Indigenous peoples in Australia, but also in New Zealand, and the myths that have grown up around this. Today I'm going to have a particular focus on the Irish nationalist movement and its representation of the plight of non-white colonised people in the 19th century. I'll also be discussing popular representations of the Irish Aboriginal connection. Now, before I begin, I do need to flag that my research uses historic materials that contain very racist ideas and words that now, by our standards, are quite derogatory and inappropriate. So keep that in mind as you're reading the materials. So let's begin with a little bit of context about the Irish colonial experience, which I'm sure a lot of us are already familiar with, being enthusiastic historians. So between 1801 and about 1921, more than 500,000 Irish men, women and children found themselves in colonial Australia and New Zealand. They came here as free settlers, as assisted migrants, as convicts, military recruits, and perhaps most famously, some came here as political prisoners, particularly to Van Diemen's Land. These migrants were Catholic, they were Protestant, they were Presbyterian. Some of them were very wealthy and some of them had very little to their names. In summary, they were a very diverse lot with different motivations and backgrounds. But if you think about it, a lot of our historical and popular literature tends to foreground the poor, Catholic, convict, and particularly rebel element. Think about the popular obsession with representations of Ned Kelly's family, or perhaps the Tasmanian emphasis on William Smith O'Brien. Now, as I'm sure we know, there was real discrimination against the Irish in Australia and New Zealand, and this continued for decades, well into the 20th century. This was, of course, particularly directed at the Catholic cohort. Now, here's a pretty standard quote taken from The Australian in 1846, and I'm sure we've all heard the popular phrase, "No Irish need apply," which was also applied to the American context. Here's a couple of examples just taken from newspaper advertisements in Australia and also in New Zealand. Now, until the early 20th century, it was actually quite common to see negative comparisons made between the Irish, Aboriginal, and even Maori peoples. These negative comparisons were a means of pseudo-scientific belittlement and, of course, consequent political disempowerment. To the Anglo-Protestant hegemony, the Irish, now especially the Irish Catholic cohort, were historically maligned as closely descended from Africanoid stock. They were perhaps not quite white, and maybe even comparable to other non-white races, like Australian Aboriginal peoples. And of course, the allegedly analogous experience of colonisation extended this comparison. So what does this perceived similarity actually mean for how the Irish saw Indigenous peoples? Surprisingly, we don't have a huge amount of scholarship to fall back on when we try to answer this question. Even in today's scholarship, we still largely view Australasian colonial history through a fairly simple lens of black versus white. By this point, in 2022, we all appreciate that this simple dichotomous lens simplifies Indigenous diversity, but we're still getting to grips with the fact that it also obscures the diversity in the white population. Now, when the Irish relationship with Indigenous peoples has been discussed in both popular media and in academic literature, really until the last 20 years, it has almost always been assumed that the Irish displayed a greater degree of empathy for Indigenous peoples. After all, if we think about it, the Irish, and particularly the Catholic Irish, have suffered what could be argued to be a parallel experience of colonisation. Over 800 years, the Irish have had their language repressed, their religion forbidden, and they've been forcibly removed from their lands. I'm sure perhaps that sounds a bit familiar. So the story goes that when the Irish landed in Australia and also New Zealand, they were able to recognise the injustices being perpetuated against Indigenous peoples. Now, at this point, I'll draw your attention to a line in an important book, which is where all my research started a few years ago. Patrick O'Farrell wrote, "In contrast to Protestant paternalist or exploitative whites, Irish Catholics treated the Aborigines as human beings, as equals, and equality extending to marriage, as distinct from the sexual exploitation common in white relations with Aborigines." This is a line taken from his very important book, The Irish in Australia. We see quite a similar interpretation also applied by other historians to the colonial New Zealand context. This romantic, rosy interpretation has been quite popular until the last 10 years, and in fact, it's not even limited to white-authored histories. So, for example, here's a quote from prominent Aboriginal activist Len Clark. Now, this highly sympathetic framing is also reflected in popular culture, in films, in novels, in plays. Now, I'm sure for our Tasmanian audience, a lot of us are rather familiar with the recent Tasmanian film, The Nightingale. This is a very moving and at times very violent film which depicts a Tasmanian Aboriginal man, Billy, who forms a tenuous alliance with a Irish female convict, Claire. The pair are bonded primarily by their subaltern status and their shared experience of injustice. Together, they embark on a mission to enact revenge against their colonial overseers. While their relationship is not perhaps framed as immediately natural, and the Irish protagonist Claire initially treats Billy with disdain and prejudice, the film repeatedly draws attention to the similarities in their painful circumstances. Over the course of the film, Billy and Claire develop a friendship, particularly after Billy realises that Claire is in fact not actually English. This moment is depicted in a moving scene in which Billy accuses Claire, as a white person, of perpetuating violence against his people. And Billy declares he wants to go back home to his country so that you can't hurt me no more. Claire replies, "What do you mean me? I didn't hurt your family. I didn't do anything. I'm Ireland. I freaking hate the English." Claire's passionate response here is in part spoken in Irish Gaelic to further differentiate her from the English. From this point onwards, we see Billy and Claire's relationship begin to soften as they recognise similarities in their circumstances. Claire's racism starts to diminish and Billy becomes more sympathetic. At one point, this is made explicit when Claire says to Billy, "You know what it's like to have a white fella take everything you have." This sympathetic comparison is obviously intentional. The artistic decision to make the protagonist an Irish woman is outwardly logical and appealing. The film has, of course, capitalised on our enduring love of the underdog and the natural assumption that an enemy's enemy is my friend. According to an actor in the film, Claire and Billy share, quote, a correlation, a mutual understanding that is the most beautifully poetic relationship, so authentic and human, end quote. However, as I'm sure you guess, there are undertones to the sympathetic depiction that undermine this apparent equivocality of status. This is clearest in the end of the film, which culminates in Billy's presumed death after he and Claire have enacted revenge. Billy, throughout the film, is consistently presented as amongst the very last of his people, and his death represents the apparent extinguishing of Aboriginality from Tasmania. However, despite Claire's apparent lack of agency, she lives on. Her powerlessness and her ultimately genuine friendship with Billy serves to exonerate her and others in her demographic from implication in historic violence against Aboriginal people. Indigenous academic and activist Larissa Behrendt is critical of this portrayal of, quote, a sliding scale of suffering, end quote, which ultimately privileges a white perspective. She argues that it is, quote, dangerous to link those marginalised within the colonial state to those being colonised, end quote. This potentially problematic depiction of comparative suffering didn't stop the film being a commercial and critical success. It won the Critics' Award at the 2019 Melbourne International Film Festival and the Special Jury Prize at the premiere in Venice. Let's look at another example. Another common trope of Irish Indigenous interactions is explored in the film The Sapphires, the most popular Australian film of 2012. This film follows the exploits of four Yorta Yorta women attempting to make a career as musicians in 1968. The sisters struggled to achieve recognition in the face of racism until an Irishman, David Lovelace, recognises their potential and becomes their manager, culminating in a successful musical tour of Vietnam. David acts as a mediator between cultures. He is depicted as less racist and more forward-thinking than his fellow white Australians. Irishman Chris O'Dowd played David Lovelace. In interviews, he noted that he felt an affinity between his culture and Aboriginal Australia. Remarking on similarities in historical experience, O'Dowd commented, I think that's why the character of an Irish guy works quite well, because we're all part of the same team. As in the Nightingale, it was necessary for this cultural facilitator to be Irish, as it perhaps seems like a more natural identity for a role that needs to span both white and black Australia. Now, David Lovelace also introduces the girls to soul music, which he describes as being about, quote, loss and struggling to get something back, end quote. David Lovelace defends his expertise in a musical genre traditionally associated with Afro-American people, stating, quote, my blood runs Negro, end quote. The implication here is pretty clear. David's Irish identity means that he is uniquely positioned to bridge the racial divide. From the audience's viewpoint, David's culture has connotations of blackness and associated experiences of racism, which makes him less prejudiced against Aboriginal Australia. The women's success in the soul genre under Lovelace's tutorage effectively justifies this rather gratifying lens. Now, I'm sure you can immediately identify that this depiction raises a few ethical and moral questions. So these works, like The Nightingale or The Sapphires, frequently depict an empathetic, enlightened relationship between the Irish and other comparatively marginalised peoples. However, while the Irish and Indigenous peoples are often represented as equals, the colonial Indigenous side is usually depicted as inevitably and tragically doomed. More modern depictions, like The Sapphires, still position the Irish as morally superior mediators. As a consequence of this rather selective lens, the Irish in Australia are exonerated from the need to repatriate and to recognise ongoing Indigenous dispossession. So let's now return to the actual colonial history. Support for this theory of comparative, positive, cross-cultural relations rests on two crucial but rather hypothetical pillars. Firstly, it's assumed that the Irish underwent an analogous and traumatic experience of colonisation in Ireland that is akin to the Indigenous experience in Australia. And secondly, superficial cultural similarities between the Irish and Indigenous peoples allow the two ethnicities to form a mutual respect for one another, strengthened by an awareness of their co-victimhood status. These superficial cultural similarities allegedly include similarities in mythological beliefs, sexual practices, musical traditions, and traditions of oral storytelling. Indigenous historian Wayne Atkinson has suggested that other shared characteristics include a mistrust of officialdom and a suspicion of government-driven policies. However, unsurprisingly, when we actually drill into the historical past, we find little evidence to support the notion of a comparatively empathetic relationship between Irish and Indigenous peoples. I won't go into it today, but arguments alleging similarities in culture inevitably rely on shallow and sometimes actually quite racist cultural tropes rather than concrete evidence. And yet still, this myth is popular. Of course, the biggest issue with this myth, aside from its historical implausibility, is that it conveniently separates the Irish from the English when we come to talk about Indigenous dispossession. It ignores Irish complicity in Indigenous dispossession. Yet, if we were to take this myth at face value for just a moment and just run with it, it seems natural to assume that radical empathy towards Indigenous people would be most expressed by the Irish nationalist movement, who were, of course, fighting for Irish independence. Perhaps radical nationalists were more willing to embrace a colourblind sense of global solidarity motivated by indiscriminate hostility towards all things English. As I'm sure some of us know, there were plenty of nationalist movements in Ireland in the 19th century, most notably the Young Ireland movement. Originally an offshoot of Daniel O'Connell's Repeal Association, Young Ireland was radical in its use of the popular press to agitate for the repeal of the 1800 Acts of Union that bound England to Ireland. Crucially, the movement took a keen interest in the situation of colonised peoples worldwide. Various associations of nationalism developed as the century wore on, such as the more radical Fenian movement and eventually, of course, the Home Rule movement. So how did these nationalists see their relationship to non-white colonised people within the sphere of a global empire? We have several contrasting historical approaches to the question of Irish nationalist interest in Indigenous peoples, but basically we have a debate between two quite separate approaches. Now, on the one hand, many historians have argued that Irish nationalists, especially the so-called non-violent constitutional nationalists, avoided comparing their situation to that of non-white victims of imperialism. In this viewpoint, historians contend that a claim to whiteness was the greatest claim to self-governance. Consequently, imperial comparisons with coloured peoples would denigrate the integrity of Ireland's white population and compromise its claim to a right to self-governance. Such a viewpoint was voiced by historian Stephen Howe in 2000 in his publication Ireland and Empire. Howe generally argued that, at least within Ireland, recognition of a parallel between Irish nationalists and coloured people worldwide, positive or negative, was the exception rather than the rule. Similar historical traditions contend that claims that the Irish were typecast as non-white people in the 19th century are overblown. Thus, it would be nonsensical for Irish people to identify with non-white peoples. On the other hand, we have the reverse view, which embraces a more popular, less critical approach and foregrounds Ireland's contribution in the global anti-colonial movement. As an example of this oft criticised but rather attractive approach, we can look to the brazenly powerful claims of Gerry Adams, past leader of Irish Republican Party Sinn Féin. In 1996, Gerry Adams rather brazenly declared the above. The approach typified by Adams argues that co-victimhood trumped race for the enlightened Irish. Superficial, circumstantial similarities become sufficient to satisfy claims of righteous co-victimhood. Of course, critics argue that this viewpoint only exists to pander to a modern progressive agenda that wants to see the Irish as trailblazing anti-imperialists. Now, we've got a few variations on these themes, but at its roots, we still have a fundamental and unresolved question about the nature of apparent empathy. Did the Irish nationalist movement ground their perceived right to self-governance in their indigeneity, or did they ground it in their whiteness? And what did this mean for their relationship to non-white peoples? We can unravel this question somewhat by looking at the conditionality of Irish nationalist sympathy in non-white people. In the 19th century, as most of us know, a tangible connection to the British Empire was codified through the Acts of Union in 1800 to 1801. This forced Irish nationalists to consider their relationship to Indigenous peoples within the global empire. They had to confront the possibility that perhaps the demands for recognition of their own inalienable rights could be applicable to non-white colonised peoples, opening the prospects for cross-cultural solidarity in a global anti-colonial struggle. I suggest that by independently claiming an association across racial lines, these groups could assert a statement of identity that subverted Anglo-Protestant control of ethnic group identity. A rhetoric identification with other outsiders in the context of a global empire could be a powerful tool to argue for improved political and cultural recognition, while also simultaneously commenting on present injustice. However, be warned, statements of cross-cultural similarity were rarely grounded in altruistic principles of universal brotherhood. Not all ethnic groups diametrically opposed to the Anglo-Protestant ascendancy were deemed automatically worthy of Irish nationalist admiration. It's erroneous to accept ongoing Irish exceptionalism and make the tempting conflation between 19th century nationalism and more modern understandings of anti-colonialism. This conflation has been encouraged as the project of nationalism has come to be increasingly entwined with anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism from about the mid-20th century. Now, returning to the material, 19th century Irish nationalist sources were typically quite critical of British colonial policy regarding the treatment of Indigenous peoples. This can be quite easily taken to correlate with empathy for Aboriginal people by Irish sympathising historians such as Patrick O'Farrell or even Bob Race. Corresponding arguments have been applied to Irishmen involved in the American colonisation and the dispossession of American Indigenous peoples. Modern commentators tend to emphasise that colonised peoples like the Irish capitalised on the opportunities opened by modernity in a demonstration of the intrinsic capacity for human improvement, a belief which in turn the Irish allegedly applied to other colonised peoples. The 19th century popular press was frequently suggestive of such a guiding humanitarian ethos. For instance, in 1852, the Sydney Freeman's Journal, which represented mainstream Irish Catholic interests in Sydney, noted, "It is natural for men who have felt themselves the heavy hand of oppression to feel for their fellow men struggling under similar circumstances, and it is a still stronger and nobler impulse of humanity to sympathise with the oppressed after having achieved the freedom of one's own country by deeds of valour." The roots of such romanticism lay in Irish self-identified victimhood. However, as I will explain, 19th century support for Aboriginal rights did not necessarily translate into a broad anti-colonial critique designed to support Irish independence. The use of nationalism as a sweeping rhetorical tool that ignored underlying tensions disguised that nationalists did not seek camaraderie with Aboriginal people by employing an arguably enlightened humanitarian ethos that valued the universal capacity for human improvement above notions of racial typologies. Rather, condemnation of the mismanagement of empire in Australia, as it pertained to Indigenous injustice, was intended to support a particular political argument about British interference in Ireland. Associating Irish interests with the maltreated Aboriginal people gave the Irish cause the moral high ground, but it also bestowed a transnational dimension that transcended the specifics of Irish domestic politics. Simultaneously, nationalists upheld the whiteness and thus the racial superiority of Irish people. Foregrounding the denial of autonomy perpetuated against non-white people served to emphasise that the Irish were, in fact, more than capable of governing their own affairs. Support for both Irish self-determination and Aboriginal rights was not incompatible with support for so-called benign colonialism, especially because colonialism presented opportunities for Catholicism. Supporting Aboriginal rights through criticising British mismanagement was a way to approve of Irish self-determination without necessarily having to argue that the Irish had an innate affinity with Aboriginal people, because, of course, to do so would have been considered offensive in line with dominant social Darwinist rhetoric of the day. Now, most 19th century Irish nationalists seem to demonstrate a considerably less than empathetic response to the Australian Aboriginal plight, and they typically push the trope that we all know of the doomed savage. Let's return to the pages of The Nation, and this feature article on the Australian Aboriginal people published in 1888. The Nation was the flagship paper of the Young Islander movement, founded by Charles Duffy, Thomas Blake, and John Blake Dillon. I'll be returning to Charles Duffy in just a moment because, as we know, he became the Premier of Victoria. This paper foregrounded a more inclusive view of Irish identity. At times, this paper, along with other nationalist circulations, such as the Freeman's Journal, expressed unusual statements of cross-cultural solidarity that challenged accepted racial standards. Yet their intention remains disputed and can be easily twisted by demands for a pleasing modern mythology that conflates editorial interest with racial enlightenment. So in October 1888, The Nation published this feature piece on the Aborigines of Australia. It contained extracts from the work of Irish-Australian anthropologist Roderick Flanagan. The article described the mystery of the ethnologic origin of the Australian tribes. It listed several theories suggesting possibilities ranging from a branch of the Negro race to even an offshoot of the Hebrew tribe. But finally, it suggested the most plausible theory was that Australian Aboriginal people were descended from a race originally from Malacca, which spread to Malaya, New Zealand, and North America. But the author was quite careful to distinguish Australian Aboriginal people, writing that they were inferior to the present native inhabitants of North America, Malaya, or even New Zealand. The piece emphasised Australian Aboriginal people's apparent lack of culture. It cited their lack of physical monuments, traces of art, religious rituals, or literary remains. It emphasised their strange spiritual practices and a strong belief in sorcery and the transmigration of the soul. The author exhibited disdain and ignorance of Aboriginal social society. It even claims that Aboriginal Australian people engage in that most barbaric of cultural practices, wife kidnappings. Alongside detailed descriptions of their primitive musical instruments, ludicrous peacemaking conflicts, and weapons suitable only for museum display, the paper condemned Australian Aboriginal people as a lowly ranked specimen of humankind, totally unworthy of Irish admiration. Towards the end of the long piece, the paper briefly mentioned that Australian Aboriginal people had suffered at the hands of the European, with some tribes being butchered in cold blood. The paper concluded that they were a doomed race, writing, "In less than 40 years, the race has been almost extinguished. It has melted before the steps of the Englishman as the Red Indian before the American." Now, in these words, readers can detect no sense of any co-victimhood, nor any implication of Irish complicity in Aboriginal dispossession. In comparison to the exoticised, detailed descriptions of Aboriginal culture, the description of the recent history of dispossession is exceedingly brief. Australian Aboriginal people's demise following European intrusion is painted as entirely unsurprising, considering their allegedly inferiority on the ethnocentric ladder. Roderick Flanagan did suggest a number of reasons that perhaps statesmen, legislators, philanthropists, missionaries, and others might be interested in the Aboriginal situation, but they were limited to, quote, "a sense of duty or from feelings of humanity or religious obligation," end quote. Nowhere did Flanagan or the editor of The Nation suggest that the Australian Aboriginal situation was of interest to any Irishman because of any apparent sense of co-victimhood. There was certainly no use of a transnational claim of colourblind solidarity to justify domestic Irish expressions of anti-imperialism. Now, 19th century coverage of the Australian Aboriginal situation in the Irish nationalist press was actually quite limited. When it was mentioned, it overwhelmingly tended to portray this erroneous trope of the doomed savage as typified in the above report. It is, of course, important to understand another complication to the possible indiscriminate extension of Irish expressions of kinship with non-white people. which was that 19th century nationalists had to walk quite a dangerously contradictory line on the racial question to balance ideology and practical concerns. Claiming open solidarity with non-white people could powerfully locate the Irish struggle in a transnational context, but it actually risked implying a critical position on the American slavery question. American support was crucial to the Irish nationalist campaign in both financial and practical terms. Openly criticising slavery in America risked this support. Although some nationalists, famously including Daniel O'Connell, were fiercely opposed to American slavery, overall, most Irish nationalists were quite divided on the question. Now, through looking at the representation in these papers, it's clear that the Irish nationalist movement, although at times sympathetic to the plight of Aboriginal peoples, did not reject the social Darwinist rhetoric of the day. We have to therefore wonder what happened when Irish nationalists actually ended up in Australia and when they had actual contact with Aboriginal peoples. Let's first look at the fictional representation of this through the work of popular author Peter Fitzsimons. So some modern authors, like Peter Fitzsimons, tend to romanticise an ideological connection between Irish nationalists and Australian Aboriginal people, despite the distinct lack of evidence. So in 2019, writer Peter Fitzsimons released The Catalpa Rescue, in which he detailed the famous escape of 6 Fenian prisoners from Fremantle in 1876. Fitzsimons suggested the Fenian leader, John Boyle O'Reilly, was able to deeply connect with Aboriginal people on account of his Fenian ideology and arguably equivalent experience of colonisation. Of O'Reilly, Fitzsimons wrote, quote, "Over time, the natives perceive that O'Reilly is different, seems to wish them well, and they're right. O'Reilly does not regard them as savages. He sees himself as a man from a land that has been occupied by the British against the will of the natives. The natives suffer the same fate. He has empathy for them from the start," end quote. Now, admittedly, Fitzsimons writes for more of a popular than an academic audience, but nevertheless, he doesn't offer any evidence to support his sentimental visions of an ideological connection based on self-identified righteous co-victimhood, nor have I been able to uncover any evidence to support this. John Boyle O'Reilly did write sympathetically of West Australian Aboriginal people in his 1879 novel Moondyne, which was loosely based on his own experiences. But there is no concrete proof that O'Reilly himself was assisted by Aboriginal peoples, much less that he sought their support based on a perceived ideological connection. Let's now look at 2 Irish nationalists who spent time in Victoria and Tasmania. It's obviously rather tempting to assume that Irish nationalists who forged a political career in Australia were comparatively more sympathetic towards Aboriginal people because of their experience of dispossession in Ireland. Such natural inferences can be read into the actions of Sir Charles Gavin Duffy, Premier of Victoria in 1871-2. An O'Connellite supporter in Ireland, Duffy was a prominent member of the Young Islander movement, and he advocated for an independent Ireland through political rather than confrontational or military means. Following political and financial setbacks, he moved to Australia in 1855. There he achieved a seat in the Victorian Parliament, where he agitated for land reform to favour working class interests. Now, in 1859, in his capacity as the Minister for Lands, Duffy was approached by 7 male representatives of the Kulin Nation of the Goulburn River area. They wished to reclaim part of their ancestral land. Duffy granted their request for 2,000 hectares of land near Alexandra. He stated, "It is, quote, in the opinion of myself and my colleagues, in the highest degree desirable to give to the Aborigines some chance of escaping the ruin and destruction which has fallen on so many of their race," end quote. This moment has been described as the first successful Indigenous land rights case in Australia. Now, historian Richard Broome suggests that Duffy's response might have been as, quote, "a result of his former involvement in land and tenancy protests in Ireland," end quote, as does historian Diane Barnwick. Similarly, historian Val Noon suggests that Duffy's personal history influenced his genuine desire to implement government policy to be beneficial to both coloniser and colonised. Noon suggests that Duffy's shock at the decline of the Kulin population from 600 to just 32 people in only 20 years might have evoked an emotional comparison to Irish population loss during the Great Famine or even during Cromwell's bloody campaign. In 1963, historian Geoffrey Searle applied a sheen of fatalistic romanticism to Duffy, writing that, quote, his Irish background condemned him to fight battle after battle against a prejudice which could never be worn down, end quote. Now, indeed, while in Ireland, Duffy did situate his own resistance within the broader context of a global struggle for cross-cultural liberty. In 1847, Duffy had called the Irish to arms, writing that victory against the British would represent a success for, quote, all the races scattered across that wide desert of sordid tyranny upon which the sun never sets, end quote. However, this case reveals deep flaws in inferring support for cross-cultural anti-colonial resistance. While Duffy's interest in the land rights of marginalised populations might have influenced his decision, it was not the only factor at all. So, for instance, after ascertaining that the desired land on the Acheron River was unproductive, except in native animals, and so of, quote, little use to white people, end quote, Duffy asked a rather simple question, quote, would they cultivate? The delegation replied satisfactorily that, quote, blackfellows and lubras go out look for food, but some always stop and turn up ground and plant potatoes and corn, end quote. Clearly, Duffy didn't grant this request purely out of respect for notions of racial equality. Central to his approval was the assumption that the Kulin people would cease their nomadic ways and cultivate, and so assume a socially acceptable position. Additionally, the land held little economic value to white settlers. The editor of the Argus, reporting on the case, also suggested that Duffy was moved by the physical dominance of the deputation, which implied that this tribe had, quote, not exposed itself to the deteriorating influences of a corrupt civilization, end quote. Thus, maybe Duffy could more easily frame his actions as supporting the cause of the romantic noble savage. So, finally, while Duffy was happy to grant the request, he had no interest in policing it. The ruling was accepted for only a year before local squatters moved back onto the land and forced the Kulin people's removal, by which time Duffy had already resigned his position. When he resumed his position in 1861, he gave the case no notice. So, despite the speculations of sympathetic historians, we can't read into Duffy's actions any greater interest in the Aboriginal cause than that of his contemporaries. Duffy's attention that the Kulin should cultivate, and his lack of interest in their case when it became clear that the land was actually cultivated by white people, suggests that Duffy accepted contemporary racial understandings of Aboriginal inferiority. Duffy no doubt considered his actions just a means to postpone the inevitable physical and moral decline of the Kulin as a consequence of their contact with white people. Let's now turn to a particularly famous Irish nationalist in the Vandemonian context. While some Irish nationalists may have perceived an overlap between Ireland and Australia in that extending the due privileges of British citizenship was the solution to their ills, this didn't imply that white Irish and the non-Indigenous peoples were social equals. Irish whiteness, in comparison to the Indigenous peoples of America, Australia, or Africa, was precisely what qualified the Irish as capable of governing themselves. And thus, we need to be quite careful of judging our heroes of the past by contemporary moral standards. We can see this viewpoint in William Smith O'Brien, which shows that it was not just limited to nationalists of Catholic extraction. William Smith O'Brien demonstrates that Protestant nationalists were just as capable of counterintuitive claims to support both Indigenous rights threatened by the duplicitous civilizing agenda of imperialism and to support a vision of benign colonialism. Born in Clare in 1803, O'Brien played a significant role in Ireland and supported O'Connell's repeal movement in the 1840s, eventually becoming a leader in the radical Young Ireland movement. After narrowly avoiding a death sentence for his role in an armed insurrection, O'Brien was transported to Van Diemen's Land. After stints at penal settlements of Maria Island and Port Arthur, he was granted conditional freedom in 1854 and returned to Europe. In his seminal work, O'Brien drew from his time in Australia and from his own personal history, suggesting that Ireland had demonstrated that attempts to impart British civilization onto Indigenous peoples was merely a convenient excuse to hide violence. He wrote, quote, "England affects to find pretexts which will justify her rapacity, but the result is the same. The weak are compelled to give way to the strong. The Red Indians in North America, the Aborigines in Australia, the Kaffirs in South America, are gradually exterminated from the soil which gave them birth." O'Brien even dared to suggest that the prior claims of the Aboriginal inhabitants of Australia ought to be distinctly recognised and carefully maintained as paramount to those of the intruding population, end quote. When this wasn't possible, O'Brien actually recommended fairly compensating Aboriginal people for their land. Now, despite voicing such noble aspirations, and despite his staunch opposition to British intrusion in Ireland, when confronted with the reality of British imperialism in Australia, O'Brien unquestionably accepted the racialised discourse of empire. In line with British contemporaries, O'Brien agreed that, quote, "a few barbarian tribes scattered over the surface of an immense territory," end quote, had no right to monopolise the land. For O'Brien, colonisation itself was ethically unproblematic, at least outside of Ireland. Like O'Connell, O'Brien understood that participation in empire granted opportunity, and he shared an idealistic vision of the possibility of benign colonialism. Yet his arguments exemplify the ideological dilemma at the heart of romantic histories of Irish nationalism. In an apparent contradiction, O'Brien was capable of both supporting Indigenous rights in Australia, using them as a pretext to call for Irish justice, but also in excusing Aboriginal subjugation because of his views on Aboriginal inferiority. Clearly, the optimism of liberal universalism often made way for a Eurocentric pragmatism when negotiating race relations became a daily reality instead of an abstract rhetorical tool. Accepting contemporary racial discourse meant that 19th century Irish nationalists were not forced to consider how the case for Irish autonomy could support non-white autonomy overseas. But they were, of course, willing to exploit Indigenous injustice to support calls for better management of empire in Ireland. Ultimately, co-victimhood did not trump race as a marker of moral righteousness for these figures, and thus we must be wary of crediting them with a more contemporary palatable agenda in terms of racial relations. Now, the representation of Aboriginal Australian peoples in the pages of nationalist publications suggests a clear sense of moral outrage at the cruel treatment of Aboriginal peoples, and it often suggests that the Irish were better positioned to sympathise with Indigenous peoples. Yet, Irish nationalists rarely offer an underlying critique of racism or even genocidal consequence as a function of empire. Australian Aboriginal extinction represented as a certainty on account of the people's allegedly base claims to human progression. Popular, modern, sympathetic representations of Irish Indigenous connections, like the Sapphires or Peter Fitzsimon's interpretation of John Boyle O'Reilly, capitalise on these existing myths. They ultimately perpetuate a lens in which positions the Irish as co-victims and thus exonerates the Irish from moral implication in Indigenous dispossessions. In 2016, historian Mary Mullen labelled this conditional cross-cultural solidarity as a transferable Indianness, making the argument that the same rhetoric of situational identity was made between Irish nationalists and American Indians. Identification with Indigenous peoples as co-victim needs to be understood as a structural position that reinforces and reproduces the structures of settler colonialism, despite superficially presenting a critique of its processes on Indigenous peoples. 19th century Irish nationalists and some sympathisers thus often offer a negative assessment of the methods of settler colonialism, but not really of its final outcome. That is, of course, outside of the Irish domestic situation. Thus, the Irish can negotiate a complex moral dilemma and simultaneously both perpetuate and condemn the processes of settler colonialism, in which, of course, they were active participants and sometimes beneficiaries. Thank you.
have to ask a question. Do you thank you for your paper, it's really interesting. Do you look at relationships between Aboriginal and Irish people and marriage between? Yeah.
Yeah, that is an avenue of investigation for me, which I've only just started looking at. As some of us who are familiar with the historiography in this area probably know, there's been a few historians that have argued that Irish people were more likely to marry Indigenous people in both Australia and New Zealand. I think that's a fairly dubious claim, perhaps, but there may be something behind it. But I'm only at the start of trying to unravel that, which is challenging because of the limitations in the sources. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. That was just fantastic. When you were showing the sapphire in particular, I was drawn back to the novel The Commitment by Robbie Doyle,
Yep.
in which he describes the Irish as the blacks of Europe,
Yep.
Dublin as the blacks of Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested in how the Irish constructed blackness and whether or not are Roman Catholic Irish are blacker than Protestant, are men are regional, blacker than metropolitan. What evidence have you found to say about how do the Irish construct blackness in this period?
Yes, good question, and well done on identifying the link with the commitments, which I think is pretty obvious in the Sapphires foregrounding of soul music as an Irish black thing. In relation to how much are the Irish, and particularly Irish Catholics, how much do they identify as black? That's an ongoing question. There's certainly a wealth of sources in which English people put down the Irish because of their simian qualities, except their base level of human progression, etc., etc. But in terms of Irish understandings of their own identity, I don't think the Irish at all really thought of themselves as black. I think that's something we're projecting onto them. But certainly it's more targeted towards Irish Catholics. And as you say, the rural stereotype as well, the rural, in Australia, the rural convict stereotype in particular. In regards to Irish Protestants, I wouldn't say that the stereotype sticks as tightly.
Question about at community level, have you tried to research down to sort of ordinary people within the Irish community, which would be a fair task, of course.
Yeah,
but, rather than look at the sort of patriots, nationalists, to actually take it down to sort of ordinary Irish people. Yeah,
good question. I find when I'm talking about this, I often have people come up to me and say, "Oh, my great grandfather was so and so, and he married this Aboriginal woman or whatnot." But the limited evidence that I have found, where I have really looked at not the patriots, but just ordinary Irish people in Australia, really, I think, suggests that most Irish people acted in their own interests. And sometimes their interests meant marrying Aboriginal people and having Aboriginal offspring, but sometimes it meant dispossessing Aboriginal people of their land. So I think we can't really make a broad sort of statement that Irish people were more enlightened in their racial relations. But yeah, certainly I do find that the actual process of looking at this, of actually examining it through the historic records, can be quite challenging because, as we know, what's left in the historic record is sometimes a bit disguised. Names change. Names don't necessarily reflect paternity. So yeah, it's a challenge.
What about the church itself, or the Roman Catholic Church? Is there any sort of indication there that they took a different view to the Anglican Church, for example? Yeah,
that's another field of my research that I'm sort of at the beginning of starting down that track. There is a view that the Catholic Church was more inclined to view Aboriginal people as capable of improvement. Of the Aboriginal soul is intrinsically capable of improvement, provided, of course, they converted to Catholicism and maintained Western standards of respectable behaviour and whatnot, in comparison to perhaps a Protestant viewpoint, which was less forward about Aboriginal capacity for self-improvement. I'm not sure about the evidence behind that, but certainly it's a view that's been put forward.
Think similarities or differences mainly between Australia and New Zealand?
Yeah, definitely. So that's particularly interesting in the nationalist context because there's actually quite a big difference in how Irish nationalists in the 19th century represented Aboriginal people and how they represented the Indigenous peoples of New Zealand. And actually, they put Maori people on a bit more of a pedestal than Aboriginal people for a variety of reasons. But I think perhaps because at the time, Maori people were mounting quite a successful resistance. And then, down the line, they achieved some level of constitutional recognition. So for Irish people, they may have been able to recognise a model in that they could aspire to. So yes, there is definitely a difference in the language between the representation of Australian Aboriginal and New Zealand Indigenous peoples.
Started on this topic briefly.
Good question. I think actually reading that quote by Patrick O'Farrell that I read out at the start, because it just seemed, it seemed like both a natural assumption and also a totally ludicrous assumption at the same time. But I could see how you would fall into that trope, which then, it leads to there's bigger questions on the horizon about the need for self-identified victimhood and the need for cross-cultural relations that spread, into the 1960s and 1970s. We see some interesting things happening now. But yeah, I think this is an underexplored avenue. And as I mentioned before, we're only starting to get to grips with the fact that white diversity in colonial Australia hasn't really been appreciated properly just yet.
Aren't any evidence of Indigenous people commenting on the Irish people?
Yes, more so in New Zealand than Australia, unfortunately. But there were a few New Zealand Indigenous leaders who actually looked quite explicitly at the Irish situation, and they actually held up the Irish situation as a model for them and commented on the parallels. Now in Australia, we don't really start to see Aboriginal people, well, at least as what remains in the written record, we don't really see Aboriginal people looking to Ireland until the 20th and really the mid to late 20th century. But in New Zealand, it did happen earlier for various reasons. Thank you.